One of the things you will most likely notice when you read through the chapters associated with parts 11 and 12 of the educational research course is that they address the qualitative research component that is a requirement for the proposal project as part of a mixed method approach. In the readings, you will notice that both qualitative research designs are presented and they are contrasted with the quantitative approach that has been presented for the most part up to this point in the course. One important thing that both qualitative research and quantitative research have in common is the fact that they both represent a systematic approach to inquiry, a systematic approach to investigating particular problems of interest. So that's a really important thing to consider. Even though some people may feel that qualitative approaches don't possess the same amount of scientific rigor, they do represent methodologies when followed according to those methodologies. They do represent approaches that have been tested by researchers in various situations and have been widely accepted by members of the research community. Now, although they have that in common, there are a number of differences between qualitative approaches and quantitative approaches. And again, these are just general qualities, and they may differ from one method to the other. But oftentimes in a qualitative approach, hypotheses about the answers to specific problems emerge from within the investigation itself. So the researchers don't necessarily go in with a clear-cut hypothesis in mind. Also, the definitions of certain variables or certain constructs may emerge from the investigation itself and do not necessarily represent pre-designed and pre-labeled aspects of the project. Another important difference is the fact that in qualitative approaches, oftentimes the samples of subjects that are used represent members of the population that are part of the situation being explored. In other words, in a quantitative approach, samples might be identified based on randomization techniques. Oftentimes in a qualitative approach, randomization is not part of a naturally occurring environment, and so an entire class might be studied, for example, as opposed to identifying individual subjects within the class and then randomly assigning them to groups that they wouldn't normally be part of in the day-to-day operation of the class. Another important difference between qualitative and quantitative approaches has to do with the fact that when results are summarized in a qualitative research design, they are often summarized in narrative fashion. So the story that is being told is summarized using words as part of the story. This is in contrast to quantitative approaches where oftentimes results are numerical in nature, and they are summarized using descriptive statistical techniques that include, means, standard deviations, ranges, that the sorts of summaries that involve the manipulation of numbers. And finally, oftentimes qualitative approaches attempt to maintain the environment without too much manipulation, maintain the environment in which the phenomena being studied naturally occur. And so there are oftentimes design strategies involved in qualitative research that go out of their way to maintain the naturally occurring integrity of the situation being studied. A good example of the difference between qualitative and quantitative approaches, I think, is considering what you might do in order to test whether or not you have the recipe down for a delicious Black Forest chocolate cake. let's say that you were curious about whether or not you were using the appropriate amount of baking soda for your recipe design. And so one approach to trying to determine whether or not you used the correct amount of baking soda as part of the overall recipe would be to prepare identical cakes, manipulating only the amount of baking soda, and then getting a random sample of people to test out and rate the qualities of the product, of the cake itself. That would be a very quantitative approach to solving the problem. A qualitative researcher might say to themselves, first of all, they might say cake is never served in a sterile environment in which a person is there just for the purpose of eating cake. That would just be really, really sad. And for those of you who have had experiences in which you have sat alone in environments eating Black Forest cakes by yourself, well, I'm sorry. Speaking of Black Forest cakes, where did that name come from anyway, and why do we associate it with something so delicious and chocolatey? I mean, if you really think about it, Black Forest, I mean, to me that evokes really wolves, bandits, marauders of some sort. There's nothing, pleasant or delicious about that. But anyway, so the qualitative researcher might say to themselves, well, cakes are served at parties. I'm going to use my best guess at manipulating the recipe for my Black Forest cake. I'm going to do the best job I can, perhaps maybe make more than one cake using slightly different amounts of baking soda. Host the party, serve them at the party, observe how people enjoy the cake or don't, identify which cakes get eaten the most, dig through the trash after the party and see which pieces of cake were thrown away, and try to identify as best you can which of those cakes included the specific amounts of baking soda. But the entire thing would be contextualized within a party atmosphere. And again, by the way, if you're somebody who would be digging through the garbage at the end of a party looking for the remains of different pieces of cake, again, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that your life has driven you to that. But that just represents a good difference between those two types of research. Now, you have been assigned a chapter that focuses on one particular type of qualitative research, and that is action research. And the reason why this was sort of singled out was because action research represents the type of qualitative research that can be at times of most value and benefit to an individual professional educator. A couple of the reasons for this are probably because action research involves solving problems of local concern, that is, problems that face an individual educator on any given day, as opposed to problems that might emerge from educational literature and have roots in theoretical questions to be solved. Another consideration when thinking about using action research as a methodology and as an approach is that there are generally two types of action research approaches. One is the practical approach that involves investigations that emerge just while in the midst of your practice, and the participatory approach involves including stakeholders in the investigation that may be influenced or affected by the problems in some way. And these could include parents, administrators, or members of the community. And that just about does it. Just remember that qualitative approaches involve just as much thought, energy, design, and input as quantitative approaches, but that they can be just as beneficial and as useful to the researcher.